When I returned to the United States, my friends organized an elaborate welcome party for me. To my surprise, Terry Chase was among the attendees. 7 years ago, he had ended our engagement, choosing instead to pursue Gan Esther, a woman he believed to be his ideal match. In front of both our families, he had boldly declared, "If I can't marry Gan Esther, I'd rather marry a dog than marry Haley Victoria." Those words not only insulted me, but also disregarded the long-standing friendship between our families. That day, utterly drained, I cried for an hour in front of my parents, begging them to annul the engagement. "I don't want Terry anymore," I pleaded. "I don't want to marry him." My parents, looking at me with pity, finally gave in. My father personally went to negotiate with Terry's parents for over an hour. In the end, the official statement was that it wasn't Terry who had rejected me, but rather the Victoria family, who had decided not to marry off their daughter. The engagement was dissolved. Although our families didn't completely sever ties, the warmth between us faded, growing colder with each passing year. Afterward, I left to study in Paris and hadn't seen Terry until today. When I looked at him now, I noticed how much he had changed over the years. He was taller and carried himself with a more composed demeanor. His handsome face now bore an air of quiet elegance. His dark eyes stayed fixed on me. No one had told me he would be here. Turning toward the friend who had planned the event, I saw Sherry quickly distancing herself. "Haley, it wasn't my idea," she said defensively. "Mr. Chase must have found out you were coming back and decided to arrange this event himself to welcome you." She added hastily, "This isn't my fault." I didn't reply. Terry smiled, his voice warm and familiar, as though the years and our broken engagement hadn't created a chasm between us. "Haley, it's been such a long time. When we were younger, I acted impulsively and hurt you. I wanted to host this gathering today to apologize." After a brief pause, his gaze met mine directly. "Do you still resent me for the past?" The way he phrased his question made it seem petty if I admitted to holding a grudge, as though I was small-minded for not moving on. So I smiled gracefully, my expression radiant. "You're right," I said. "It's all in the past. After all, we came from the same social circles, and enough time had passed that he no longer mattered to me." Outwardly, I let bygones be bygones. Picking up a glass of wine, I smiled lightly and said, "Sherry mentioned you married Gan Esther over a year ago. I haven't had the chance to congratulate you. Here's a toast to you." His face remained neutral. One would expect a man who had married the love of his life to display at least a hint of joy. But Terry appeared entirely unmoved. It was as though my words carried no meaning. Before I could think further, he picked up his glass and drank, not with the air of someone accepting a blessing, but more like a man trying to drown his thoughts. Honestly, I didn't care enough to dwell on it. As the guest of honor, the conversations naturally centered around me. Old friends reconnected, bombarding me with questions and comments. Someone asked how many boyfriends I'd had while in France. Another brought up my global art exhibitions, mentioning how successful they had been. Then someone half joked, half complained, "Really, Haley, do you have to be so perfect? Your exhibitions sell out, and you have galleries worldwide. My father is always comparing me to you, scolding me for not being more like you. How am I supposed to compete when all I do is shop, chase celebrities, and dream about sports cars?" I laughed. "Art is just a hobby for me," I said casually. Terry, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke. "It's been years, and now you've learned to be modest," he said with a faint smile. His tone was natural, like that of an old friend. It carried a certain warmth, as though the harsh words he had once spoken to me had never existed. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. His words felt ambiguous, but I couldn't tell if it was intentional or just my imagination. As I tried to find the right reply, he continued, "I saw your Dreams of Basel series. It was excellent." The atmosphere shifted. Even my friends, who had been laughing and chatting moments ago, grew quiet, exchanging subtle glances. Maintaining my composure, I smiled politely. "Thank you," I said. Then, almost teasingly, I added, "Did you go with Gon to see it? By the way, why isn't she here tonight? It's been years since I last saw her. We're old classmates, after all." His expression became neutral, and his voice turned casual, almost detached. "She had something to take care of at home," he replied. His tone made it seem as though he were speaking about someone entirely unimportant. I didn't understand why he spoke of Gan so indifferently, the woman he had once been so passionate about. But I had no desire to get involved in his affairs. Forcing a laugh, I steered the conversation elsewhere. The evening progressed, and as we were leaving, we found Gone Esther sitting in the lobby. Her eyes were glued to the private elevator, her face tense with unease. The moment the elevator doors opened, she stood abruptly, as though she had been waiting anxiously for us to emerge. We all froze, confused by her sudden appearance. Gan forced a strained smile, looking around the room, but when her gaze landed on me, standing next to Terry, her face turned deathly pale. Her expression was one of sheer panic, as though I posed some kind of threat. I was bewildered. Gon had changed so much from the person I remembered. I recalled meeting her during the second semester of her first year in high school when she transferred into our class. She had stood awkwardly at the front of the room, her ill-fitting uniform draped over her frail figure. She looked underfed, her plain features marked by nervousness and discomfort. The math teacher introduced her with a bright smile. "This is Gan Esther, one of the top students in every exam. Let's give her a warm welcome." The room fell silent as countless curious eyes focused on her. Our private school was filled with wealthy, influential students, and academic performance alone wasn't enough to earn respect, especially not with her shabby appearance. Feeling a twinge of sympathy, I smiled at her and started clapping. Slowly, others joined in, and the applause grew until it filled the room. The teacher, smiling gratefully, turned to Gon and said, "This is Haley Victoria, the Student Council President. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask her." But Gon never approached me for help because she had Terry. Terry, who was still my boyfriend at the time, became her desk mate since the only available seat was next to him. I didn't know then if their betrayal began at that very desk. Gan came from a poor family and suffered from severe hypoglycemia and anemia. I remembered one morning during self-study when she fainted and Terry carried her to the infirmary. Another time, Terry's mother returned from Belgium with gifts for both of us. She asked me to choose first, but Terry grabbed a box of handmade chocolates and said, "This one's mine." I found myself confused because Terry had never liked sweets, and I had never seen him show any particular fondness for chocolate. Later, he even requested the recipe for the desserts made by our family's chef. Not wanting to trouble myself, I simply had the chef prepare some and sent them directly to him. I assumed Terry had developed a sudden liking for sweets. It wasn't until much later that I discovered a chocolate wrapper on Jean's desk, along with the desserts I had given Terry, which were prepared by our chef. It became clear that Jean was the one with a sweet tooth, not Terry. I tried convincing myself that Terry was simply being considerate toward his desk mate, even though he had never been the type to involve himself in others' lives or play the hero. Deep down, I had my doubts, but Jean was so plain and unremarkable that it never crossed my mind Terry might betray me for her. After all, I was different. I stood out. I was the most beautiful girl in school. Back when Gossip Girl was at its height, people playfully called me Goody Goody Victoria. The nickname wasn't due to my personality, but because I excelled in background, grades, and popularity. How could I have ever imagined that Terry would betray me and fall for someone like Jean? But now, 7 years later, Jean was no longer the frail, impoverished girl from our school days. She was dressed head to toe in designer clothes and accessories, with large, bold logos on display. Though the items were undoubtedly expensive, they felt tacky and mismatched. Jean approached us with a smile and greeted me casually. "Haley, you're back." As she spoke, her eyes darted between me and Terry, filled with probing curiosity that felt almost intrusive. It made me uneasy, and I furrowed my brows, sensing a discomfort I couldn't quite explain. Terry was the first to respond, his tone cold. "What are you doing here?" Jean hesitated, glancing at Terry before forcing a smile that came across as both pitiful and overly eager. "I was out shopping, and the store owner mentioned that you and your friends were here to welcome Haley. So I thought I'd wait and head back with you." Her explanation was riddled with flaws. She lifted her shopping bags, adding, "The manager here heard I was around and sent 2 bottles of red wine as a gift for Mr. and Mrs. Chase." She emphasized Mrs. Chase as though staking a claim, as if to assert her place. At her words, Terry's expression darkened. He frowned, clearly irritated. Behind me, I could hear some of my friends stifling their laughter. Given the Chase family's status, it was unlikely that even the manager, let alone the owner of this club, would send gifts so casually without proper notice. It was clear the 2 bottles of wine, which Jean presented as if they were treasures, were nothing more than an embarrassing display of desperation and a lack of understanding of her social standing. Over the year and a half since Jean had married Terry, this sort of awkward, cringeworthy behavior had likely become routine. Terry's voice turned sharp with impatience. "Didn't I tell you to stay at home? Why are you out here embarrassing yourself?" Some of my friends couldn't help but burst into laughter. Jean's already pale complexion turned ghostly white. She stood there, frozen, looking at Terry as if she couldn't comprehend why he was upset or what she had done wrong. No one offered her an explanation or guidance. Instead, the others laughed at her lack of refinement and her clumsy attempts to fit in. I, however, was taken aback by Terry's behavior. Without thinking, I turned to look at him. His face remained impassive, his expression cold, entirely unaffected by the ridicule aimed at his wife. It was as if the person being humiliated wasn't someone he was connected to at all. I paused, frozen for a moment. This wasn't the Terry I remembered. Back in school, when Jean was ostracized for not fitting in, she had endured collective exclusion. Even when Terry forced me to end our engagement and I had lashed out by bullying Jean, he had always stepped in to protect her. He was fiercely loyal, always standing by her side, even if it came at the cost of our relationship. Yet now, as he looked at Jean, his eyes were filled with disdain and impatience, as though he no longer cared about her at all. It was hard to reconcile this version of Terry with the one who had once defended Jean so fervently, even when it jeopardized everything else. How could he, who had once stood by her so resolutely, now treat her as though she were nothing more than a burden? The first time Terry defended Jean was during a French class. For us, French was second nature. From the age of 2, we had been taught by private French tutors, and all our household communication was conducted in the language. Our grammar and pronunciation were as refined as those of French aristocrats. That day, the French teacher called on Jean to read a passage aloud. The moment she began, whispers started spreading across the room. By the time she reached the middle of the passage, someone couldn't hold back their laughter anymore. Although Jean excelled academically, her lack of formal training showed in her awkward pronunciation. The laughter spread like wildfire, growing louder until Jean froze, unable to continue. The teacher, realizing the situation, asked her to sit down and quickly tried to redirect the lesson. After class, Sherry approached Jean and, in a loud voice, began mimicking her pronunciation, joking with a classmate in exaggerated French. Her imitation was so accurate that others couldn't help but laugh. Jean sat at her desk, her head bowed, her bangs covering her face. From the side, I couldn't see her expression, but her frail silhouette and tense shoulders gave away her discomfort. For some reason, it all felt pointless to me. I wanted to tell Sherry to stop, to leave Jean alone. Before I could say anything, Terry, who typically stayed out of such matters, acted. He had been resting with his head on his desk, but at the sound of Sherry's mocking laughter, he sat up. Without a word, he picked up Le Petit Prince from his desk and slammed the hardcover book down loudly. The noise echoed through the room. "Shut up. It's too noisy," he said coldly, his tone sharp. Sherry's laughter ceased immediately, and the room fell silent. To ease the tension, I turned to Sherry with a calm smile. "Class is starting, Sherry." She nodded and quickly muttered an apology before returning to her seat with her friends. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jean glance at Terry, her eyes wide and bright as she whispered something to him. She was probably thanking him, though Terry's expression remained stoic and indifferent. Later that day, I ran into Jean again in the library. Midday was always the quietest time there, with most students either eating lunch or gossiping. Jean sat in a secluded corner by the window, intently practicing her French pronunciation using a small recorder. I didn't think much of it and leaned back to relax. That was when I saw Terry, still as handsome as ever. He walked over to Jean with Le Petit Prince in hand. Without pausing, he stood next to her and said, "Practicing like this won't help." Without waiting for a reply, he sat down beside her, opened Harry Potter, and pointed to a sentence. "Read this," he instructed. Jean blushed deeply and hesitated before softly reading the passage, her voice faltering. Terry corrected her patiently, his voice steady and encouraging as he guided her through the proper pronunciation. The library was utterly still, sunlight streaming in through the windows, illuminating the tiny particles of dust floating in the air. In that serene moment, the two of them appeared almost like a painting, quiet and intimate. Jean, however, seemed more like an observer in the scene than an active participant. Yet, as she gazed at Terry, her cheeks flushed slightly, and in a barely audible voice, she murmured something. I envied Victoria deeply, and from that moment, I realized I couldn't stand Jean. Of course, no one could ever guess my true feelings. I always maintained an air of ease and indifference. Though my classmates held me in high regard, I never participated in petty cliques or excluded anyone. The first time I deliberately targeted Jean was during a PE class. We were split into boys and girls to practice tennis. Everyone quickly paired up, leaving Jean as the odd one out. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the court, clutching her racket nervously, her face flushed as she glanced around. She looked utterly helpless, even fragile. I approached her with a smile, extending my hand. "Let's team up," I offered. John blinked at me, visibly surprised. Me?" she stammered. I nodded, keeping my smile. "Yes, you." Jean's face brightened with gratitude as she returned my smile. But as I remembered the scene in the library with her and Terry, I quickly turned away, letting my smile fade. Indifference settled in. I couldn't help but wonder if that grateful smile of hers would last. Jun didn't manage to return a single ball. It was like walking a dog. Every time I served, I aimed the ball at spots she couldn't reach. She scrambled frantically, chasing after it, bending down repeatedly to retrieve it. "I'm so sorry. I'm terrible at this," she apologized, over and over. She hadn't realized I was doing it on purpose. As a small crowd of classmates gathered to watch, I heard someone whisper behind me, "What's up with Victoria? She's never acted like this toward anyone before. Did the new girl offend her?" Pretending not to hear, I kept up my relentless serves. Finally, in her attempt to catch one, John tripped and fell hard to the ground. Standing there, I smiled down at her and apologized insincerely. "Oh, I'm so sorry." Jean kept her head lowered, clutching her bruised knee. Her voice was barely audible as she mumbled, It's okay." Maintaining my polite smile, I added, "Your tennis skills are really poor. I hope you don't hold me back during the group match." Jean struggled to her feet, apologizing again, clearly humiliated. Everyone around us watched with interest until Terry strode over. He glanced at me before gently taking the racket from Jean's trembling hands. Fixing me with a cold stare, he smiled faintly and said, "She's not good at tennis, Haley. I'll practice with you." Terry completely outclassed me. To be fair, he was using his left hand, but it didn't matter. At 12 years old, he had won a national youth tennis championship. I had only picked up tennis to have something to talk about with him, so my amateur skills didn't even come close to matching his. For half an hour, I struggled to return his shots, barely managing to hit a few. Whenever I missed, a boy who had a crush on me would eagerly retrieve the balls and hand them back. I refused to back down, stubbornly keeping my eyes on Terry. He showed me no mercy. Finally, his last serve grazed the net and hit me squarely on the knee, right where Jean had been injured earlier. The sharp pain made me gasp, and if no one had caught me, I would have collapsed to the ground. Terry didn't react. He stood there, cold and emotionless, his voice tinged with cruelty as he said, "Haley, with your skills, even if no one holds you back, you still wouldn't win." After that, he turned to Jean, waved her over, and said, "Come on, let's go." The way Jean looked at him was like a fairy tale princess gazing at her knight in shining armor. She nodded obediently, whispering, "Okay." Later, a few classmates helped me to the infirmary, where the nurse treated my injury. Sherry stayed by my side. Usually loud and carefree, even she seemed uneasy. "Haley, has Terry lost his mind?" she asked. Her words turned out to be prophetic. Everything Terry did after that could only be described as madness. Though now, looking back, it all seems absurd. The irony was almost unbearable. If he regretted it all now, it was laughable. A few days after the welcome banquet, Sherry finally worked up the courage to call me. "Haley, are you upset? she asked hesitantly. I was mixing paint at the time and replied casually, upset about what? There was a pause before she sighed. Haley, I need to ask you something, but promise you won't get mad. Do you still have feelings for Terry? Her question startled me so much that I nearly fell off my chair. Steadying myself, I laughed, half in disbelief and half in amusement. What on earth gave you that idea? Tell me so I can fix whatever I'm doing to make you think that. After another hesitation, Sherry explained, It's just, Terry seems to regret marrying Jean. Before you came back, he asked about you a few times. She then filled me in on everything I had missed while I was abroad. After our engagement ended, Terry's mother firmly opposed his relationship with Jean, yet Terry had stayed in the country to attend university with her. After graduation, he moved out of the Chase family home, refusing financial support and starting his own business. At the time, even though everyone sympathized with me, we couldn't help but be impressed by Terry's grand gesture. It seemed like true love. Eventually, the Chase family caved. A year later, they reluctantly agreed to the marriage. But on the wedding day, everything fell apart. Jean's family, eager to flaunt her newfound status, brought along countless relatives and neighbors. Terry, trying to save face, didn't separate the guests. Business partners and Jean's boisterous family were crammed into the same hall. The result was chaos. Children running wild, loud conversations, and Jean's parents proudly boasting about their daughter's marriage into wealth. One of her uncles even demanded Terry kneel and bow to him during the toast. For someone like Terry, who had only ever bowed to Chase family elders, it was a humiliation. That night, his mother was so furious, she ended up in the hospital. From then on, things spiraled. Jean's family took advantage of Terry at every turn. Her brother's DUI, her uncle's demand for a house, her disabled father needing a job. Big and small problems piled up until Terry's feelings for Jean were completely drained. Listening to Sherry, I couldn't help but recall Terry's words when he once explained why he had chosen Jean over me. Haley, you were born with everything, privilege, fortune, whatever you wanted. But Jean had nothing and still managed to shine, growing from the dirt with resilience. That's why I admire her. Those words were still vivid in my memory, but the admiration and affection he had for Jean had long since disappeared. Casually, I interrupted Sherry, my tone cold. I don't care about him or Jean. What happens between them is none of my business. Don't bring it up again. I'm not interested. Then, more firmly, I added, if you mention him to me one more time, our friendship is over. All right, Sherry said quickly. I won't bring it up again. I just wanted to look out for you. She hesitated before stopping herself from saying more, but I knew what she meant. Once, I had loved Terry so deeply that he consumed my every thought. But the past was like the wind. It could never be caught again. Who truly loves only one person in their lifetime, especially when that person has caused them pain? The only reason I still exchanged a few words with Terry now was because I chose to be gracious and composed. In truth, he no longer held any importance in my life. If it were up to me, I would have avoided any further interaction with either Terry or Jean. Unfortunately, it seemed I was the only one who felt this way. They clearly didn't share my sentiment. 2828. I encountered Terry again at a business cocktail event. In the same social circles, running into one another was inevitable, whether I liked it or not. Feeling stifled, I stepped out onto the terrace to get some fresh air. Moments later, Terry approached with a wine glass in hand and stood beside me. He greeted me casually in a low voice. I only half listened, responding distractedly, until he turned to gaze at the rolling hills in the distance. His expression was unusually somber, almost forlorn. After a long pause, he spoke, his tone laced with guilt. "Haley, how have you been living abroad all these years?" I turned my head, fixing him with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Terry Chase, you're a married man. Under this moonlit sky, don't you think it's inappropriate to start a conversation like this with your ex-fiancé?" My words were anything but courteous, yet he chuckled, unfazed. "It's just a friendly greeting. You're being overly sensitive, Haley," he said with a nonchalant shrug. Unable to resist, I offered a pointed remark. "Sorry, but after everything, aren't you the one with a questionable history?" He paused briefly, but instead of reacting with anger, he let out a bitter laugh. Sighing, he turned his attention back to the scenery. "I'm just so tired," he muttered quietly. We both understood the subtext. Terry's marriage had become a source of ridicule within our social circle, a rarity for the Chase family. I didn't continue the conversation. Instead, I casually lifted my wine glass, preparing to leave. Before walking away, I smiled politely and said, "But she's the one you chose, isn't she?" The next time I saw him was at his mother's birthday celebration. Ever since my return, Terry's mother had been calling me frequently. While the relationship between our families had grown distant over the years, there were still business ties, and she had always been fond of me. I could ridicule the man who betrayed me, but I couldn't bring myself to disrespect his mother. When she called personally to invite me, she said, "Haley, my birthday is next Wednesday. Can you come? It's been 7 years, and we haven't heard a word from you." When an elder extends such an invitation, it's difficult to refuse. After hanging up, I went to pick out an appropriate gift. When I arrived at the Chase family estate, something felt amiss. The gathering was intimate, with only close relatives present, making my presence seem out of place. I hesitated briefly, but when Terry's mother saw me, her face lit up with genuine joy. Surrounded by familiar faces, including Terry's aunts and older relatives, she waved me over enthusiastically. Reluctant to make a scene, I plastered on a polite smile and walked over to sit beside her. Jean was nowhere to be seen. Terry's mother clasped my hand and examined me closely. Her eyes welled with tears as she spoke nostalgically. I watched this child grow up, and now she's even more graceful and accomplished than before. The others chimed in, echoing her praise. Terry's mother beamed at their compliments, her voice warm with fond memories. The first time I saw her, she was 5 years old. Her parents had just moved in next door. She wore a pink puffed skirt and smiled sweetly as her mother brought her over to introduce her to the neighbors. I remember thinking, why didn't I have a daughter like her? In moments like this, there was no need for me to say much. I simply stayed quiet and smiled at the right moments. Terry and Jean arrived during dinner. Terry seemed to know I was there and wasn't surprised to see me. He acknowledged me with a nod, but Jean froze. Her face turned pale, and she struggled to maintain her composure. Forcing a smile, she greeted Terry's mother. "Mom, happy birthday." Terry's mother glanced at her, but her face remained cold, as if she hadn't heard. Without responding, she held my hand and guided me to the dining room. "Good child, come sit with me," she said warmly. Even I, as oblivious as I claimed to be, could sense that something was off. The awkwardness reached its peak during the meal. The dishes served to me were all my favorites from years ago. As she introduced each one, Terry's mother sighed with pity. "You've been through so much, haven't you, my dear? You've lost weight. Try the black truffle. You used to love it. Whenever Terry upset you, this dish always cheered you up. Lily, the chef, knew you were coming and prepared it for you days in advance. Go on, taste it, and see if it's as good as you remember." Before I could respond, a loud clatter interrupted us. Jean had accidentally knocked over her plate, perhaps from nerves or distraction. A servant hurried to clean up, but Jean awkwardly refused their help, grabbing a napkin and crouching down to clean the mess herself. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she stammered repeatedly. As she was about to kneel under the table, Terry raised his hand to stop her. His expression was icy as he said, "Enough. Look at yourself." "What are you doing?" Turning to the servant, he ordered curtly, "Emily, clean it up." Terry's mother was visibly upset, her voice trembling with anger. What a disgrace. How embarrassing. Thankfully, it's just family here. But still, she glanced at me and said sharply, "Haley, look at this. Look at what's happening now." At that moment, she lost all composure. Without filter, she blurted out, "If Terry had married you back then, we wouldn't be dealing with this nonsense now." Clutching her chest as if the frustration had physically hurt her, she turned to me, holding my hand tightly. "Haley, I remember how much you used to love Terry. This foolish boy hurt you, but the past is the past. Can you forgive him for my sake? Just this once. Can you forgive him?" The room fell into an oppressive silence. All eyes were on me, including Terry's. He remained expressionless, quietly waiting for my response. Jean, holding her face in her hands, ran out of the room in tears, but no one moved to follow her. I calmly set my chopsticks down, flashed a polite smile, and addressed Terry's mother. Auntie Lucy, I'm truly honored to be here today, especially since you personally invited me on your birthday. Even without a grand celebration, you've always been so kind to me. Although Terry betrayed me later, I've never forgotten your kindness. Today is your special day, and I should be the one making you happy. But the question you've asked me is difficult to answer. I paused, glancing briefly at everyone in the room before continuing firmly. Lucy, I'm sorry, but the reason I returned to the country this time is to introduce my boyfriend to my family. I'm getting engaged. You've watched me grow up, and no matter what happened in the past, it's all behind me now. I would love for you to witness my happiness. The room went silent. Terry's mother stared at me in shock, struggling to process my words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she asked, How is it that no one has heard about this? Pausing, she added, Which family son is lucky enough to be with you? I lowered my eyes, keeping my tone steady. Ryan Phipps, the eldest son of the Phipps family. A sharp intake of breath broke the silence. Terry's mother didn't say a word for a long time, but it was his aunt who eventually eased the tension, offering a warm smile. That's a wonderful match. A perfect pairing indeed. Haley is truly fortunate. I responded with a polite smile, but didn't add anything further. Terry's gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable. However, his eyes reflected a mix of emotions. After what felt like an eternity, he managed a faint smile and said, Congratulations. I gave him a small nod, maintaining my composure, and returned his smile. Thank you. From that moment, my dealings with the Chase family were effectively over. Terry's mother stopped calling me altogether, and I later heard she had to spend some time recovering in the hospital. The last time I saw Jean was at my gallery. I was chatting with Sherry when my assistant informed me that someone was willing to pay a significant amount for one of my paintings, but wanted to speak with me first. When I stepped out, I found Jean standing before one of my pieces. As my footsteps echoed, she turned to face me. It was odd. My impression of Jean had always been that of an awkward and timid person, someone who never knew quite what to do with her hands or feet. Yet, with just the two of us there, that nervousness vanished. What replaced it was a look of pure, seething hatred. She glared at me, her voice sharp. Victoria, you're just here to watch me embarrass myself, aren't you? I smiled calmly. To be honest, my life was so busy and filled with people and responsibilities that I barely thought about her anymore. I think you're overthinking things, I replied evenly. Her gaze softened for a moment before shifting to one of deep sorrow. Suddenly, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Do you know Terry is going to divorce me? I overheard him speaking to a lawyer. He doesn't want me anymore. Why? She choked on her words. You're already about to get engaged, so why is he leaving me? What did I do wrong? Is it because of my background? I don't have a family like yours. Everyone laughs at me, thinks I don't belong. But can I help it? I just wanted to be like you, to have a family like yours, to be accepted. But I don't have what you have. You were born with everything. If we had started on equal footing, I wouldn't be here, humiliated. If you were me, you wouldn't be where I am now. Even now, you rely on your family. Her sobs filled the empty gallery. Clearly, she had been holding these feelings inside for a long time, waiting for an outlet. Even if that outlet was me, I sighed, thinking back to the Jean who had tried so hard to fit into the Chase family, eager to please and desperate for validation. Jean, I said calmly, you're mistaken. If I were you, I wouldn't have ended up in this situation. First, I remember you were a good student. If I were in your place, I wouldn't have stayed reliant on the Chase family after graduating. I would have used their connections and resources to establish my own career. Second, you mentioned your background and lack of education compared to mine. If I were you, after marrying Terry, I would have made an effort to learn the social etiquette, to network, to dress, and carry myself properly. I would have observed more, listened carefully, and spoken less. But sadly, you've been married to Terry for almost 2 years, and in that time, I've seen no growth in you compared to who you were 7 years ago. Lastly, I wouldn't allow my family to live off others, draining the Chase family's resources. Your family should be your support, not parasites feeding on their wealth. How can you expect respect when you allow such behavior? I knew I was crossing a line by giving her advice she hadn't asked for. I wasn't sure why I even felt compelled to speak. Perhaps it was because I still remembered that young girl standing nervously at the front of the classroom, trying so hard to make her way in a new environment. Jean lowered her hands, revealing tear-streaked cheeks. Though she was still crying, there was a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes, as if my words had given her something to cling to. If I do what you say, do you think there's still hope for me? She asked softly. A pang of regret, or perhaps pity, tugged at me. But the truth was harsh. Jean was beyond saving. Her chances in the Chase family had always hinged on Terry's love, and now that he was abandoning her, it was far too late to change what should have been done years ago. Her desperation was almost palpable, but I couldn't bring myself to voice the reality. Instead, I chose my words carefully, offering advice that felt like a kind gesture. Jean, if Terry has already contacted a divorce lawyer, I suggest you take the initiative and propose the divorce yourself. You have a prenuptial agreement, don't you? If you show the Chase family that you know when to step back, they might feel guilty and offer you a better settlement. Jean shook her head, laughing and crying at the same time. Her eyes were filled with disbelief. No, no, Haley. Terry and I can still fix this. We can work things out. Her voice trailed off as if she were lost in thought. Then, As though spurred by a sudden idea, she turned and hurried away, likely to make one final attempt to save her marriage. Sherry, who had been silently watching from a distance, stepped forward. "I thought you hated her," she said. I turned to Sherry with a faint smile. "I never considered her a rival. I only felt sorry for her." She saw Terry as her one chance to escape her circumstances and clung to that hope by marrying him. What she didn't realize was that her greatest asset should have been her dedication to herself, investing in her own growth and future. Life is a series of choices, and the path we walk is shaped by those decisions. John blamed her family for her situation, but she was where she was because she made the wrong choice at every turn. Later, I heard about the ongoing divorce proceedings. Jean refused to let go, dragging the process out and turning it into a public scandal. The Chase family's reputation suffered, and the drama became a source of amusement for our social circle. Eventually, the noise died down. How it was finally resolved, no one knew. A year later, at my engagement party, the Chase family attended. Terry was there with his new fiancée, the daughter of a prominent figure in the confectionery industry. They looked perfect together, their family backgrounds well matched. Guests congratulated Terry warmly, their conversations filled with smiles and shared interests. There were no awkward moments, no spectacle, no mention of Jean. She had vanished from our social circles, as if she had never existed. The atmosphere was filled with elegance and charm. I stood in the garden, holding a glass of champagne, watching the dancers under the lights. My fiancé approached, placing a hand on my shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. I smiled at him. "Nothing," I replied.